The Walsh family home stood resolute on the edge of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, its beige exterior a silent sentinel of military precision. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lemon cleaner, a sharp contrast to the weight of unspoken expectations that clung to every corner. It was 2003, and Colin Walsh, the eldest daughter at 19, stood in the doorway of the dining room, her new military uniform stiff with pride. The fabric hugged her shoulders, a tangible emblem of her dreams, each stitch a promise of purpose. Her heart thrummed with the thrill of it. Her first step into the family's sacred tradition of service, a legacy that pulsed through 3 generations like a heartbeat. Her father, Roy, a retired Air Force colonel, had medals that gleamed in glass cases. Her mother, Marilyn, a former combat medic, wore her silence like a badge of honor. Colin wanted to be part of that story, to carve her name into the Walsh legacy. But as she stood there, boots polished to a mirror shine, Marilyn sat at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee with a gentleness that felt like a betrayal. The morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across her mother's face, softening the edges of her words but not their impact. "Not everyone is meant to be exceptional, sweetheart," Marilyn said, her voice soft as a lullaby, as if she were offering a gift wrapped in kindness. "Some must hold up the stars." The words landed like a quiet explosion, splintering Colin's pride into shards. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, the weight of her uniform suddenly unbearable. Her mother didn't look up, didn't see the way Colin's hands trembled, or the way her jaw tightened to keep the hurt from spilling out. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. Marilyn's tone held no malice, only the calm certainty of someone who believed they were sparing their daughter pain. But to Colin it was a verdict. She was not enough. The Walsh family didn't speak failure aloud, they didn't need to. Their silence was a language of its own, fluent in judgment. Colin's younger sister, Erica, was the star they all orbited. At 16, Erica already carried herself with the poise of a future officer. Her every achievement, debate team victories, early ROTC honors, celebrated with letters pinned to the fridge and toasts at family dinners. Colin's own milestones, like her acceptance to West Point, were met with nods, brief and perfunctory, as if they were expected but unremarkable. When Erica was promoted in her cadet program, the family wrote about it in the base newsletter, framing her as the next chapter of their legacy. When Colin returned from her first covert training mission, a grueling 7-month stint in a place she couldn't name, no one met her at the airport. Her father's only comment, tossed over his shoulder as he flipped through a newspaper, was, "You're always so busy," as if she'd missed a routine appointment rather than survived operations in shadows no one dared acknowledge. That Thanksgiving, the sting deepened. The dining table, polished to a gleam, was set for family and guests, but Colin's usual seat was given to the neighbor's son, a smug 20-something who'd just been accepted to law school. "It's a big deal," Marilyn said, arranging the centerpiece with care. Colin stood at the sink, eating turkey off a paper plate, the clink of her fork against the porcelain a lonely rhythm. Her medals, earned in silence, remained packed in a cardboard box in the garage, next to old camping gear and forgotten Christmas decorations. The family's laughter filled the house, but it wasn't for her. They spoke of Erica's latest triumphs, her brother's steady climb through the ranks, the neighbor's son's bright future. Colin was a ghost in her own home, her presence acknowledged only in the absence of praise. The hurt wasn't new, but it was cumulative, a quiet soundtrack that played beneath every family gathering. Each holiday, each visit home, carried the echo of Marilyn's words. "Some must hold up the stars." Colin heard it in the way her father's eyes slid past her to Erica, in the way her mother's questions about her life were perfunctory, answered before they were asked. They never called her a failure outright, but the silence screamed it. At 19, she was still young enough to crave their approval, to believe she could earn it. But that night, as she stood alone on the porch, the Kentucky air cool against her skin, something shifted. The stars above were bright, indifferent, and she realized she didn't need to hold them up. She needed to stop chasing their light. "I'm done," she whispered to the night, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. She'd faced simulations of enemy fire, navigated obstacle courses in the dark, carried the weight of orders that could mean life or death. If she could survive that, she could survive her family's indifference. The vow settled into her bones, a quiet rebellion. She would forge her own path, not for their applause, but for the truth she carried within her. Colin Walsh was no failure. She was a soldier, and she would prove it, even if no one in her family ever saw. Colin Walsh's life was a tapestry woven in shadows, each thread a secret she couldn't share. By her 21st year, the world she inhabited was one of covert operations and classified briefings, a far cry from the polished halls of West Point where her family believed she'd faltered. The official story was that she'd left after her first year, unable to handle the discipline, the structure, the weight of expectation. Her father, Roy, had shaken his head, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You didn't have what it takes." Her mother, Marilyn, had offered a tight-lipped smile, as if to soften the blow, but the silence that followed was sharper than words. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that Colin hadn't left. She'd been pulled, handpicked for a secret intelligence program, so classified it existed only in whispers, its files buried in servers that didn't officially exist. No graduation ceremony, no framed diploma on the Walsh family's mantle, just a one-way ticket to places where the sun burned hotter, and the nights hid horrors no tourist would ever see. For 20 years, Colin lived in the margins of her family's narrative. While Erica, her younger sister, climbed the ranks to lieutenant colonel, and her brother, a major, married on the pristine lawn of Fort Campbell's chapel, Colin operated in the dark, Damascus, Libya, unnamed deserts where the air tasted of dust and fear. Her missions were the kind that didn't make headlines, the kind that saved lives but left scars no one could see. In Libya, during Operation Candlestrike, she'd spent 4 days hidden inside the walls of a hostage camp, her breath shallow, her body cramped, coordinating a rescue that brought 30 civilians home. 3 of her men didn't make it. Their faces haunted her, their names etched in her memory like a private memorial she carried alone. She'd held their hands as they bled out in the sand, her voice steady as she promised they wouldn't be forgotten, even as her own family forgot her. Back home, the Walsh family's story unfolded in neat, public chapters. Erica's promotions were celebrated with framed articles and toasts at formal dinners. Her brother's wedding photos adorned the living room, a testament to the family's pride. Colin, though, was absent from the frame, literally. A cousin once let slip that a family photo from 2004 had been cropped to balance the composition. Her face excised as if she'd never been there. The excuse was flimsy, but the message was clear. She was the daughter who didn't belong, the one who'd failed to uphold the Walsh legacy of visible valor. They didn't know about the 6 months she'd spent embedded in Damascus, navigating a labyrinth of informants and double agents, or the sleepless nights in Stuttgart, poring over reports that could shift the tide of a covert war. They didn't know because she couldn't tell them, and they never asked. Colin sent flowers to her mother on her birthday, each bouquet a quiet plea to be remembered. She mailed Christmas cards to her father with a fake Maryland return address, a fiction to maintain the illusion of a normal life. From afar, she watched Erica's star rise, her name lauded in military circles, her face beaming in base newsletters. She saw her brother's wedding through a grainy photo posted online, the family gathered on the chapel lawn, their smiles bright and oblivious to her absence. Each gesture, each flower, each card, was a tether to a home that no longer claimed her. The pain wasn't in the missions, the gunfire, or the weight of decisions that kept her awake at night. The pain was in the silence, the way her family's love seemed reserved for those who shone in the spotlight. One evening, in a safe house in an unnamed city, Colin sat alone, the hum of a generator her only company. A cracked mirror hung on the wall, reflecting a face hardened by years of secrecy. Her eyes, once bright with the hope of approval, now carried a quiet resolve. She traced the scar on her wrist, a memento from a mission gone sideways in Yemen, and thought of her niece, a girl of 6 who'd once asked, wide-eyed, if she'd ever shot a real gun. Colin had smiled, crouching to meet her gaze. "I wrote a plan that brought 30 soldiers home alive," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. The girl had blinked, then run off to play with a toy tank, uninterested in truths that didn't glitter. That moment, like so many others, was a reminder. Her victories were invisible, her sacrifices uncelebrated. Yet, in the quiet of that safe house, Colin felt a flicker of defiance. She wasn't the failure her family believed her to be. She was a soldier, a strategist, a ghost who moved through the world's darkest corners to keep others safe. The weight of her family's judgment was heavy, but it was not her truth. She packed her gear, the familiar ritual grounding her, and vowed to carry on. Not for their approval, but for the lives she'd saved and the ones she still could. The stars her mother spoke of didn't need holding up. They needed someone willing to walk in their shadow. And Colin was that someone, even if no one ever saw. The Kentucky autumn was a painter's dream, with golden leaves clinging to branches like embers refusing to fade. In a nondescript safe house halfway across the world, Colin Walsh sat at a chipped wooden table, her phone vibrating against the grain. The screen glowed with her mother's name, Marilyn Walsh, a name that carried the weight of a combat medic's precision and a mother's cool detachment. Colin hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. It had been months since they'd spoken, and each call felt like stepping onto a tightrope stretched over a canyon of unspoken truths. She answered, bracing herself. Marilyn's voice was crisp, clinical, like she was reading a patient's chart rather than speaking to her daughter. "Erica's getting promoted to lieutenant colonel," she said, the words clipped and purposeful. "You should come to Fort Campbell for the ceremony. Just don't wear anything odd. Don't overshadow her." No greeting, no warmth, just instructions delivered with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. The request stung, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so familiar. Colin's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the phone as if it could anchor her against the tide of hurt. She wanted to ask why her presence was always conditional, why her mother's love felt like a checklist. Instead, she said, "I'll be there," her voice steady despite the ache blooming in her chest. She wasn't going for a red carpet or open arms. She was going to see if, just once, her family could look at her and see the woman behind the shadow they'd cast her into. For years, she'd been the ghost in their story, the daughter who couldn't hack it at West Point, the one whose absence was explained away with shrugs and half-truths. They didn't know about the missions that kept her awake, the nights spent in a Libyan hostage camp, the decisions that saved lives but cost her pieces of herself. They didn't know because they never asked, and Colin had learned to carry her truth in silence. Back in her temporary quarters, Colin stood before her closet, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and memory. Her old dress uniform hung in the back, crisp and untouched, its brass buttons catching the dim light like stars in a forgotten sky. She ran her fingers over the fabric, the texture a reminder of the pride she'd felt at 19, before her mother's words had cracked her open. Beside it, she placed a neutral blouse and slacks, quiet clothes for a quiet presence, designed not to draw attention. In the mirror, her reflection stared back. A face neither young nor old, just settled, with lines carved by desert sunrises and sleepless nights. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, held the weight of choices no one in her family could imagine. "It's time," she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. Was it time to forgive, to let go, or to demand to be seen? She wasn't sure, but the words felt like a vow. Fort Campbell greeted her with the familiar hum of military life. Jeeps rumbling, flags snapping in the breeze, the distant cadence of a drill sergeant's call. The Walsh family home hadn't changed. Same beige paint, same weathered porch swing creaking in the wind, same flag flying with solemn pride. Colin parked near the logistics fence, the gravel crunching under her boots like a memory of her childhood, when she'd run across this same lot, dreaming of being a soldier like her father. Inside, the house smelled of lemon cleaner and old paperbacks, a scent that wrapped around her like a ghost. Marilyn stood in the dining room, arranging name cards with surgical precision, not looking up as she said, "Go change your shirt. You'll sit next to Erica, but don't interrupt her speech tomorrow." No hello, no embrace, just orders, as if Colin had driven 10 hours to be a prop in Erica's moment. Her father, Roy, offered a stiff pat on the back, the kind officers exchanged before retiring for the night. "Good you made it," he said, his gaze already sliding past her to the room where Erica held court. She emerged in her dress blues, bars polished to perfection, ribbons aligned like a campaign map. The room orbited her, guests kissing her hand, officers nodding in approval. When she noticed Colin, she waved a manicured hand. "This is my sister," she said lightly. "She served for a bit, now does admin, I think." The words were casual, but they cut deep, reducing Colin's 20 years of covert service to a clerical footnote. A cousin leaned in, whispering, "So Virginia's better than nothing, right?" Colin smiled, just enough to deflect, not enough to show the teeth of her anger. Silence had its own dignity, especially when her truth was classified. That night, as laughter filled the house, Colin stepped onto the porch, the cool air a balm against the sting of being unseen. The distant notes of a brass band practicing carried through the night, ghostly and fleeting. She sat on the steps, her boots scuffing the wood, and felt the weight of her family's indifference settle like dust. Tomorrow, Erica would shine, and Colin would be the shadow. But shadows had their own power, their own truth. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to be seen, if only for a moment, in the light of her own making. The ceremonial hall at Fort Campbell was a cathedral of command, its high ceilings and brass fixtures casting a golden glow over rows of folding chairs arranged with military precision. The air buzzed with anticipation, a hum of ranks and titles mingling like static before a storm. Colin Walsh sat in the third row from the back, wedged between a junior officer's fiancée, whose perfume was a floral assault, and an older woman who smelled of lavender and judgment. The program labeled her row family unassigned, a bureaucratic way of saying she was present but peripheral, a guest in her own family's legacy. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the edge of her neutral blouse, chosen to blend into the background. But her heart was a drumbeat, steady and unyielding, as she prepared to witness her sister Erica's moment in the spotlight. Erica stood at the front, a vision in her dress blues, her posture flawless, her ribbons a constellation of achievements. The flag to her left stood rigid, her polished boots to her right a mirror of discipline. Her speech was a masterclass in control, each word a calculated strike. She spoke of duty, perseverance, and the need to distance oneself from those who abandon the sacred trust of the uniform. The jab was sharp, aimed directly at Colin, the sister who'd supposedly fled West Point's rigor. Heads turned, eyes flickering toward Colin with pity or curiosity. Their whispers a soft blade. "That's the one who couldn't hack it." Colin's face remained a mask, her gaze fixed forward, but inside her chest tightened, the old wound of her family's dismissal bleeding anew. She wasn't here to defend herself. She'd survived worse than their judgment. But the weight of their assumptions pressed against her ribs. Then the air shifted. The double doors at the back of the hall swung open, and General Hammond entered, his presence a quiet thunderclap. His uniform was crisp, his stride deliberate, the kind of authority that made spines straighten before minds registered why. His eyes swept the room, a predator's scan, and locked onto Colin. Recognition sparked, bright and undeniable, and her breath caught, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of being seen. He marched toward her, his boots echoing on the polished floor, and stopped beside her seat. With a snap of his heels, he raised his hand in a salute, sharp and proud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear, cutting through the room's hum like a blade. "General Walsh, it's an honor to see you again." The hall didn't just quiet, it froze. Erica's voice faltered mid-sentence, her note card trembling in her hand. The applause that had followed her earlier words died, replaced by a silence so thick it seemed to hum. Colin rose, her movements steady, and returned the salute, not for the eyes now fixed on her, but for the man who'd once trusted her with lives in the chaos of Candlestrike. Her mother, Marilyn, dropped her glass, the shatter echoing like a gunshot across the room. Roy, her father, half stood, then sank back into his seat, his face a mask of confusion and something like shame. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that her? The ghost commander from Candlestrike? I thought she was just admin." Colin's heart didn't race, her palms didn't sweat, but the air around her vibrated, electric with the weight of years unraveling in a single moment. For the first time, she felt the room's gravity shift, the spotlight that had always belonged to Erica now fractured, casting light on the sister they'd erased. Erica tried to continue, her voice hoarse, her eyes darting for anchors in a sea of shifting attention. But the energy had changed. Eyes no longer clung to her every word. They were on Colin, or worse, on the gap between what they'd believed and what they now glimpsed. The ceremony ended with polite applause, but the tension lingered like smoke after a controlled burn. As guests dispersed, Erica cornered Colin near the exit, her face a storm of hurt and fury. "Why didn't you say anything?" she hissed, her voice low to avoid the lingering officers. "You let me stand up there like a fool." Colin met her gaze, unflinching, her voice calm but edged with steel. "If truth makes you shrink, you never stood tall with it." Erica's lips parted, then closed, her eyes blinking rapidly as if to hold back a flood. She brushed past, her boots clicking sharply on the floor, leaving Colin alone in the doorway. Outside, the Kentucky dusk was cool, the sky streaked with the last embers of sunset. Colin stood still, her breath visible in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She hadn't come to steal Erica's light. She'd come to claim her own. To stand in a room that had never seen her and refused to be invisible. General Hammond's salute wasn't just recognition. It was a crack in the narrative her family had built around her. For the first time, Colin felt the sharp, sweet relief of occupying space without shame. Her truth no longer buried in the shadows of their silence. The guest quarters at Fort Campbell were a study in transience. Beige walls, a stiff bed, a lamp that hummed faintly, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. Colin Walsh dropped her keys on the chipped wooden dresser, her boots scuffing the linoleum as she kicked them off. The ceremony's aftershocks still pulsed through her. General Hammond's salute, the shattered glass of her mother's shock, Erica's faltering voice. For a moment she'd been seen, her invisible valor laid bare. But the weight of that moment didn't linger long. As she sank onto the bed, her eyes caught a manila envelope on the small table, unmarked, its presence as deliberate as a landmine. No name, no seal, just a handwritten scrawl. "For you." Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from the instinct honed in years of covert work. Something was wrong. She opened it with steady hands, pulling out a single sheet. A scanned email, dated 2 years prior, its sender redacted. The subject line read "Reckless Operation, Civilian Casualties." The words accused Colin W. of commanding an unsanctioned mission that led to civilian deaths, the details chillingly specific, dates, coordinates, outcomes lifted almost verbatim from a classified Candlestrike report. Only 3 people had seen that report. Colin, a lead analyst, and Erica, then a junior officer with peripheral clearance. The phrasing was hauntingly familiar, echoing a briefing she'd given in a steel-lined bunker in Stuttgart. Her voice steady as she justified a decision that saved lives but cost others. Her blood ran cold, not from the accusation but from the betrayal it implied. Someone had weaponized her truth. Colin's mind raced back to a brief investigation 2 years ago, when she'd been pulled for a routine review after Candlestrike. The inquiry had been dismissed as a system error, a red flag triggered by automated protocols. She'd believed them, grateful to move on, but now she saw it for what it was. A seed planted, a spark meant to smolder. The email's metadata was encrypted, but Colin's training kicked in. She traced its path through a labyrinth of servers, her fingers trembling not with fear but with a quiet fury. Whoever sent this had access to secrets buried deeper than most generals could reach. She found Erica at the after-party, a glittering affair in the officers' club where champagne flutes clinked and laughter masked ambition. Erica stood at the center, her dress blues pristine, surrounded by admirers basking in her glow. Colin waited, a shadow at the room's edge, until Erica stepped outside to take a call. The night air was sharp, the stars above Fort Campbell bright and unforgiving. Colin held up the scanned email, its edges worn from her grip. "Did you send this?" she asked, her voice even, not accusing but demanding truth. Erica's eyes dropped to the paper, then met Colin's, her face a mask of defiance that cracked under scrutiny. "Yes," she said, the word a whisper, heavy with guilt. "Why?" Colin's question wasn't a plea. It was a scalpel, cutting through years of silence. Erica's shoulders sagged, her polished facade crumbling. "Because you weren't supposed to win," she said, her voice breaking. "You left West Point, you disappeared, and they still talked about you. Dad, Mom. They never stopped wondering where you were, what you were doing. I did everything right, climbed every rank, and it was never enough. I thought if I could erase you, I'd finally be seen." The confession hung between them, raw and jagged, a child's jealousy twisted into a betrayal that could have ended Colin's career. Erica's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry, she was too proud for that. Colin felt no anger, only a deep, aching sadness. The sister who'd once trailed her through the base, begging to be included, had tried to bury her to claim the spotlight. Colin didn't shout or accuse. She folded the email, tucking it into her pocket, and turned away, the night air cooling the burn of understanding. "You don't erase someone to be seen," she said softly, her back to Erica. "You stand taller." Her boots crunched on the gravel as she walked away, each step a refusal to let betrayal define her. The stars above were indifferent, but they were witnesses to her truth. Erica's words had been a blade, but Colin had survived worse. She'd survived invisibility, and she would survive this too. Back in her quarters, she sat at the table, the envelope a silent accusation. The email wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a breach of security, a crack in the foundation of trust she'd built through years of sacrifice. She traced the scar on her wrist, a relic from a mission in Yemen, and remembered the soldiers she'd held as they died, their blood warm on her hands. She'd carried their weight, their stories, their trust. Erica's envy had endangered that, but Colin wouldn't let it break her. She closed her eyes, the hum of the lamp a faint pulse, and made a new vow. She would uncover the full truth, not for revenge, but to protect the lives that depended on her silence. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning, and Colin Walsh was no stranger to fighting in the dark. The blare of the alarm tore through the quiet of Colin Walsh's guest quarters at Fort Campbell. A piercing wail that wasn't the familiar morning bugle, but a siren built to jolt the blood with adrenaline. It was 3:17 a.m., the darkness outside thick with the weight of a Kentucky night. Her phone lit up on the nightstand, its screen flashing an emergency protocol. All high-clearance personnel report to Coordination Center. Breach detected. Her heart didn't race. It hadn't raced in years, not since the deserts where hesitation meant death. But her mind snapped to attention, sharp as a blade. She dressed in seconds, muscle memory guiding her hands as she pulled on her boots, the laces tight against her fingers. The manila envelope from the night before, with its damning email, sat on the table like a ghost, its accusations still burning in her chest. Erica's confession had been a wound, but this alarm was a warning. The betrayal ran deeper than family. The corridors of Fort Campbell were alive with controlled chaos. Officers moving in half-dressed urgency, some still lacing boots, others clutching coffee as they hurried toward the operations hub. The air smelled of ozone and tension, the kind that preceded a storm. A grim-faced sergeant handed Colin a file, thin but heavy with implication. "Operation Candlestrike," he said, his voice low. "Leaked to a darknet forum. Time-stamped 3 hours ago." Colin's stomach twisted as she opened the folder. The breach detailed classified specifics of the mission she'd led in Libya. Coordinates, casualty reports, her own tactical decisions. Worse, the digital trail pointed to a device once assigned to her, an inactive terminal still tied to the base's network. It was as if her past had been resurrected to accuse her, a ghost given form to haunt her. In the operations room, General Hammond sat across from her, flanked by 2 officers from Military Intelligence Command, their faces carved from stone. The room was cold, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. "You're not under arrest," Hammond said, his voice steady but edged with scrutiny. "But you're under suspicion." They demanded access to her communications. Every email, every call log from the past 6 months. Colin didn't argue. She handed over her phone, her laptop, her encrypted drives, knowing the truth wasn't in her files. It was in the envelope she'd found, in Erica's whispered confession under the stars. "I need to lead the investigation," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I have the clearance, the experience, and the motive." Hammond's eyes searched hers, then he nodded, extending a hand. "General Walsh, the floor is yours." She assembled a task force, a decision that felt like stepping into a minefield. Against her instincts, she included her family, Roy, her father, with his archival access from his post-retirement consulting role, Marilyn, her mother, whose medic training and later forensic biology expertise could dissect digital traces, and Erica, whose recent login had triggered the breach, tasked with mapping system vulnerabilities. The first meeting was a study in frost. Roy opened with a briefing, his eyes glued to the screen, his voice clipped like he was reading a casualty report. Erica presented her segment in a sterile monotone, never meeting Colin's gaze. Marilyn glanced between them, her hands folded tightly, as if watching her children unravel into strangers. Colin didn't flinch. She was here for answers, not warmth. The breakthrough came late, in the hum of a server room where Colin combed through archived logs. An AI security scan flagged a dormant Trojan, embedded in a 2017 logistics file, never activated until now. The date was a jolt. 2017 was the year she'd clashed with Derek Glade, a strategist in Mosul who'd pushed for a reckless civilian sweep. Colin had blocked him, insisting on a phased containment that saved lives but earned his resentment. Derek wasn't just vindictive. He'd had access to campaign servers, enough to plant a digital trap. Erica's unsecured laptop, left overnight in the comm station, had been the key to unlock it. Colin remembered Erica's odd tone when she'd mentioned leaving her laptop, as if testing her. Now the pieces fit. A grudge from Mosul, a sister's envy, a breach that threatened everything. Colin's hands trembled as she traced the Trojan's path, not from fear but from the weight of betrayal stacking like stones. Derek had used Erica's mistake, her leaked email, to frame Colin, to paint her as a reckless commander whose secrets could topple trust. She looked at the glowing screen, her sister's login a digital signature in the chaos. Erica, the girl who'd once cried when Colin left for West Point, had unwittingly unraveled a thread that could destroy them both. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, but Colin's resolve hardened. She wasn't fighting for her name alone. She was fighting for the soldiers who'd trusted her, the lives she'd saved, the truth she'd carried in silence. The breach was a battle, and Colin Walsh had never lost a fight she chose to wage. The night was electric, a storm brewing in the Kentucky sky as Colin Walsh led a tactical team toward a decommissioned technical bunker on the edge of Fort Campbell. The air was thick with the scent of rain and resolve, the kind of tension that hummed before a strike. The breach of Operation Candlestrike's classified details had escalated from a digital ghost to a tangible threat, its trail leading to Derek Glade, a strategist whose grudge against Colin had festered since Mosul in 2017. Her boots crunched on the gravel, each step a metronome of purpose, her team moving in silent precision under her command. The bunker, a relic of forgotten operations, was still wired to a secondary military network, a perfect hideout for someone like Derek, who thrived in the shadows of systems others overlooked. They breached the door with surgical efficiency, the lock giving way under a controlled charge. Inside, Derek sat at a terminal, his face bathed in the glow of a screen mid-download, a compressed data packet blinking on the display. He didn't flinch as the team stormed in, his eyes meeting Colin's with a calm that bordered on arrogance. "You took too long," he said, his voice bitter but not unhinged, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Colin's pulse was steady, her gaze unflinching. "Hands off the keyboard," she ordered, her tone low but lethal. He complied, raising his palms with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The team secured him, cuffs clicking into place, but Colin felt no triumph, only the weight of a truth about to unravel. In the interrogation room, a sterile box of concrete and fluorescent light, Derek laid out his plan with chilling clarity. "I didn't want to humiliate you publicly," he said, his voice steady, almost regretful. "I just wanted you out of the room." He'd engineered the leak to frame Colin as a reckless commander, a liability whose clearance would be stripped, barring her from NATO briefings and strategic talks. "You rose too fast," he continued, his words laced with venom. "People stopped asking you questions, stopped challenging you. I used your sister's mistake, her email, to light the fuse." He'd known about Erica's envy, her anonymous email accusing Colin of misconduct, and had exploited it, planting the Trojan that Erica's unsecured login had triggered. He hadn't broken the Walsh family. He'd watched them fracture and claimed the pieces. Colin's chest tightened, not from anger but from the clarity of how deeply betrayal could cut. She thought of Erica, her sister's confession under the stars, the child's jealousy that had spiraled into a weapon Derek wielded. Back at the operations hub, Erica sat across from Colin, reading the transcript of Derek's confession. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the paper until it creased. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking, eyes fixed on the words as if they could rewrite themselves. Colin leaned forward, her voice soft but unyielding. "Sometimes we burn a field out of envy, forgetting people sleep in the grass." Erica's face crumpled. But her pride held her tears at bay, a soldier's discipline masking her guilt. The next day, as the task force compiled its final report, Erica submitted an addendum, her handwriting steady but her signature heavy. She took full responsibility for the email that had sparked the breach, admitting her role in giving Derek the opening he needed. No criminal charges were filed. Her intent hadn't been treason, only a desperate bid for recognition. But the official reprimand would cost her promotions for 5 years. She signed it without hesitation, her eyes meeting Colin's for the first time without defiance. "I thought I needed to win," she said quietly. "I didn't see what I was losing." Colin nodded, not in forgiveness but in acknowledgement, the first step toward something new. The final task force meeting was different. Roy, their father, stood to deliver the closing remarks, his usual colonel's authority softened by something human. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on Colin. "I owe this team an apology," he said, his voice low, cracking on the edges. "Especially to Colin. I let medals and pride blind me to what mattered." It was the first time she'd heard him admit fault, the first time his gaze held hers without sliding away. Marilyn, silent until now, reached for Colin's hand under the table, her grip trembling but firm. Erica didn't cry, nor did Colin, but their shared glance carried a new weight. Not of rivalry, but of recognition. Erica was no longer the star casting shadows. She was a woman learning to stand without pushing others down. As the meeting adjourned, Colin stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a distant memory. The confrontation with Derek had closed one wound but opened another. The realization that her family's fractures had been exploited by someone who saw their pain as leverage. Yet, in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Her father's apology, Erica's accountability, her mother's touch, they were small, fragile steps toward a new frame. One where Colin might finally be seen. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. The morning of the Regional Strategic Conference at Fort Campbell dawned with a fog that clung to the base like a memory, softening the edges of the world. Colin Walsh stood backstage, the quiet hum of a projector and the faint clink of name badges against uniforms filling the air. The banner behind her read, "Reimagining Shadow Intelligence in Post-Conflict Asymmetrical Environments." 62 commanders, 30 senior advisors, and 100 observers filled the hall, their presence a weight Colin felt in her bones. She wore no uniform, just a tailored blazer, her only adornment the invisible scars of 20 years in the dark. Her heart was steady, but her mind buzzed with the gravity of what she was about to do. Tell her truth, not for applause, but to redefine the narrative that had erased her. Among the attendees was Lieutenant Colonel Erica Walsh, listed as a field officer trainee in the program. Colin had sent the invitation herself, a single line in the email's notes. "It's time to learn what you thought you knew." No explanation, no warning, just a chance for Erica to see her sister anew. As the lights dimmed, Colin stepped onto the stage, a laser pointer in hand, her presence unadorned but commanding. The room hushed, eyes locking onto her. Not as the failed daughter, not as Erica's shadow, but as General Walsh, the ghost commander of Candlestrike. She began with a simple truth. Some missions have no name. Some leaders have no plaque. Some battles begin where judgment replaces understanding. Her voice was clear, cutting through the room like a blade through fog. Heads tilted. Officers who'd once echoed Erica's criticisms now watching with recalibrated respect. She spoke of Operation Candlestrike, declassifying her decision to spare a hostile zone where 7 children were trapped. A choice that saved lives but nearly ended her career. "I signed the order to stand down," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It cost me a medal, an investigation, and a piece of myself. I'd make the same call again. Truth doesn't need forgiveness, it needs to be seen." Gasps rippled through the audience, not from drama, but from clarity. War wasn't just territory, it was moral ground, and leadership was carrying the weight of choices no one else could understand. Erica sat in the second row, her posture rigid, pen poised, eyes fixed on Colin. For once, she didn't fidget or look away, she listened, her face a canvas of conflict and dawning respect. As Colin closed, she turned to the microphone at the stage's edge. In conclusion, I've asked Lieutenant Colonel Erica Walsh to share her reflections as an officer of the new generation. The room stirred, heads turning to Erica, who rose slowly, her dress blues immaculate but her expression unguarded. Her voice was firm, though her eyes glistened. I grew up thinking honor was standing tallest, being heard loudest, she said. Today, I learned it's knowing who to learn from and having the courage to admit it. The words hung heavy, a confession and a bridge. The applause that followed wasn't for Colin alone, but for the idea that strength could be silent, that leadership could be taught by those once envied. In the back, Marilyn sat, hands folded, not clapping but nodding, a quiet approval of Colin's journey, not her rank. After the session, a senior general approached, his handshake firm. I once thought women had no place commanding battlefields, he admitted, his voice low. I was wrong. Colin smiled, not for victory but for truth. Mistakes don't define us, she said. Refusing to learn from them does. A week later, she hosted a family dinner at the old Walsh home, the table set with deliberate care. She spoke her truth. The 3 days underground in Iraq, the shelved Syrian medal, the investigations she'd endured. Roy asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice was soft, almost lost. "You never asked," Colin replied, "and I didn't think you'd believe me." Marilyn admitted mistaking her packages for apologies, not proof of existence. Erica handed her a training reform proposal, seeking her input, a gesture of partnership. Roy pulled a photo from the mantel, a faded barbecue snapshot. "We're missing someone," he said, promising a new one. Colin nodded, not smiling but forgiving. Months later, in her DC apartment, she taught at Fort Campbell. Erica always in the front row, challenging and learning. One evening, Erica brought a cake iced with sister teacher. Colin didn't need medals or history books. She needed her family to see her, not through mistakes or triumphs, but through eyes that finally understood. Some battles carve canyons in the soul, but the bravest act is to stay, to be seen, and to forgive.